everybody. Welcome. So good to see all of you here today. Just wanted to introduce you. Well, I'll introduce myself first. I'm Amelia. I think most of you know me. I'm the assistant site manager here. I'm really excited to introduce to you Nerlynn. She is a history instructor at Central Piedmont Community College, also a colleague of mine, former colleague of mine. We had our offices in the same building, and Nerlynn's was just one floor above mine, so we ran into each other quite often, so it was always fun. Anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Nerlynn. So, yay,
All right, so good morning, everyone. As she mentioned, I'm Nerlynn, and that's me on the screen. I look like this all the time, okay? Let me just kind of just put it out there. You know, I like a very relaxed atmosphere. Right? I like to walk around. I like feedback, so we're going to have a good time. I'm very excited to be here, and just want to thank Amelia and Scott and the entire team, all of the volunteers, entire staff, Susie. It was great to meet you again today and remind me of who you are, and Mark and Tracy, and remind me your name one more time. I just mentioned Dylan is also a volunteer, so thank you so much for the invitation. I'm excited to be here. So let's jump right in because we only have an hour. I'd like to leave the end of today's session some time for us to just ask questions, discuss. I'd like to hear from you, your thoughts. Anything that comes to your mind, feel free to take notes, you know, so you don't forget, all right? So with today's presentation, I'll stay on the side so you can see the screen a little bit. Today's presentation is a part of America 250, right? So America is turning 250 years old next year. The signing of the Declaration of Independence was in 1776. And when we think about the history of America, you know, the history really is a double-edged sword. When I think of America, I think of a dichotomous story, right? So on one end, you celebrate like victories in war, you celebrate the expansion of territory, the development of the republic, but we also have to ask ourselves, what did it cost to accomplish these things, right? So that's what we will focus on today, because we can't just discuss the favorable aspect without acknowledging those aspects that aren't as favorable, because collectively, that is America's story. So that's what we will go through today. Today's presentation is basically we will examine how American expansionism has displaced both Native and African-American communities, and also how expansionism has forced upon them to adopt an American identity. And I'll walk you through that, right, step by step. So American expansionism, acculturation, and assimilation. Let's start from the beginning, right? Let's start with colonial America. Start there. So since the 15th century, European explorers had been traveling to and through the Americas, right? So for the most part, native nations within the Americas, when I say Americas, I'm referring to North and South Americas. It's not for English, okay? Just to be clear, just want to be clear. So for the most part, native nations within the Americas, they had brief experience, right, interacting with Europeans. But once we transition into the 16th and 17th century, this is when European nations began establishing permanent settlements in the Americas, right? The Spanish established the oldest permanent European settlement, and that's in St. Augustine. They did that in 1565. And then that settlement predates the one that we're probably most familiar with, which is Jamestown, 1607, and that's where we will begin. So Jamestown, 1607, Jamestown is the first permanent English settlement in North America. And it was the first of 13 colonies. It would go on to be, these 13 colonies, the first 13 states of the United States. Now Jamestown, the group that initially settled Jamestown, you have 104 males, right? Men as well as boys. They are the ones who initially settled this colony, and prior to moving to Jamestown, they had to visit this location. Now, I just want to stop and kind of give a caveat. Anytime you're studying history, something I like to tell my students is make sure that you put the humanity back in history, right? Because sometimes we think about it, it's something that's very distant, it almost can feel mythical, but I want you to think about people actually living this experience. So you're talking about 104 people that they relocate not to just a different country, but they go to a different continent. They go to the other side of the world, right? They are unfamiliar with the location. They're unfamiliar with the weather. They're unfamiliar with the ecosystem. So you're talking about animals as well as plants. And also they're unfamiliar with the natives who live there, even if they've heard about them, okay? So the location of Jamestown, this was a place that was home to the Powhatan chiefdom. Sometimes the Powhatan chiefdom is referred to as the Powhatan Confederacy, right? But we'll call them the Powhatan chiefdom. Now the Powhatan chiefdom was comprised of more than 30 tribes, and each tribe had its own chief, but all of them submitted to a single leader, which was Chief Powhatan. These are the people that the early settlers will have the most interaction with. It's estimated that around 15,000 of them comprise this Powhatan chiefdom. So with these early settlements, right, the early settlements in colonial America, typically when these settlers arrived, they usually established settlements in the Chesapeake area as well as New England. So Chesapeake, think Maryland, think Virginia. When you think of New England, like Massachusetts, you know, New Hampshire, Connecticut, in those areas. That's typically where they established their settlements. Initially, the natives who lived near these settlements, they pursued alliances with the settlers when they arrived. They traded with the English. And early on, it's a bargain. It's an even trade type of system, right? So these early settlements, they traded certain goods, such as far as Europeans, what goods they gave, and specifically the English. They traded things like woven cloth, think of that, metal kettles, okay? You have guns, iron axes, things like that. That's what they traded. Now, the natives that lived in that area, they also traded as well. One trade that many natives would participate in would be the fur and animal skin trade. And they would provide this in order to receive these European goods. Now, as a result of this trade, you'll see on both sides the demand for whatever they're receiving is going to increase. So in North America, the population of certain animals, such as beavers, such as deer, they begin to diminish because of this trade, right? You even have some Native American nations that begin encroaching on territory that is claimed by another Native nation just so they can feed this growing demand, right, for this trade. So you see that. So the growing desire for European goods, it's going to lead to an ecological imbalance. It leads to resource depletion in the area. It also adds to internal conflict, right, that may have already existed within a Native nation, and it will also add to conflict between Native nations. So this is just one example of the effects of these two worlds kind of interacting. But over time, what we do see is over time, Native nations, as they gradually incorporate European goods, right? As they gradually incorporate aspects of European culture, simultaneously, they are experiencing a decline of their own cultural practices. So whatever traditional skills that they had, and they've been practicing them for centuries, as they participate in this trade, those skills, those practices, they start to decline. For example, farming, hunting, cooking, that's going to change because of the use of European metal goods, right? You also have the use of alcohol. That will unfortunately dramatically increase and become very disruptive to Native communities, right? Many of the changes that came, they were unexpected, they were unintended, but many of them would unfortunately leave an immutable consequence forever. and this goes both ways, right? Although our focus today are Native African, African American communities, but it goes both ways. So the English colonists as well, they also experienced change as well. They planted native crops. They would also learn certain techniques from the native nations around them, such as snowshoes or canoes, things that were vital to their survival. You even have European manufacturers. This trade becomes such a norm that European manufacturers begin marketing specifically, goods specifically for native nations, right? So this starts to grow. So eventually, proximity to European culture, the adoption of European goods, and the continual interaction of these two worlds, it's going to lead to major cultural change. Major cultural change, and that major cultural change will result in both African as well as Native nations adopting an American identity. So we see here early stages of acculturation. Now, let's move on to these cultural changes that occur. There are two terms that I'll use for the rest of this presentation. I always like to give some type of definition, working definition, so we're all on the same page, right? So these two terms are very important to explain the cultural changes that these communities experience. So the first one is a term known as acculturation, right? Acculturation, excuse me. Acculturation. So what is acculturation? Acculturation is the process where people from one culture gradually adopt the ways of another culture, but they retain parts of their original identity. That's a cultural acculturation. And then we have assimilation. Now, I'll just say assimilation, but to be specific, I'm actually speaking of cultural assimilation. Cultural assimilation is very similar. It is the process where people from one culture gradually adopt the ways of another culture, losing their original identity, right? So they're very, very close. Now with assimilation, let me just talk about this a little bit so you kind of get an idea of what that means, because you can see that difference there with assimilation losing their original identity. So with assimilation, you have a dominant culture, and then you have a smaller culture or a minority culture. Eventually what happens is that minority culture is absorbed into the dominant culture. What does that actually look like? So in a practical sense, assimilation can include certain things like learning the language of the dominant culture. It can be things like that. It includes adapting your diet, changing the food that you eat. Assimilation also includes changing the tools that you use. Assimilation can include even changing your values, your beliefs, ideas. Religion is also in there. Your behavior can change from assimilation. Assimilation also includes even changing your name. All of that is part of the process of assimilation, right? So the assimilating group, in many ways, they become indistinguishable from that dominant culture. Think of it that way. So with both acculturation and assimilation, groups that were once distinctively different, they now share some type of commonalities, right? They now have areas where they merge. With assimilation, it's more fully blended, and with acculturation, it's partially blended, right? So is everyone tracking with me so far? Okay, you look great. You look great. You're tracking with me. I want to make sure. Real early in the morning to be going over these big words, right? Acculturation, assimilation, but you're going to sound so extra smart once you leave here. I promise, I promise. So with acculturation and assimilation, what are some examples? Let's go through some examples of what it looks like. Now, Jamestown is a great example of acculturation, right? Jamestown and the early English settlements in general really is a great example. So as a result of them trading with one another, both the natives as well as the English, they incorporated aspects of another culture, right? Without fully abandoning their own. So that's a great example of acculturation. We see that. Another great example of acculturation is religious syncretism. Now, let me break this one down just a little bit. So, religious conversion was one justification for colonization, right? Religious conversion was one justification that Europeans used, not only to colonize an area, but to colonize the people of that area and parts of what we call the New World. Some native nations, when they would come into contact and they were offered conversion, some of them welcomed the new religious beliefs, right? Whether it was Catholic or Protestant, what they would do is they would incorporate aspects of that new religion and then they would blend it into their own, kind of forming a new way to practice, right? And that is religious syncretism. So you still have aspects of your own religious practices, you just incorporate aspects of another. And we see this in different examples. I have two examples here, the Hurons and the Haudenosaunee. Haudenosaunee sometimes are known as the Iroquois Confederacy, but they call themselves Haudenosaunee, so we're going to call them by that name. So the Hurons and Haudenosaunee, great examples. They practiced religious syncretism when they came in contact with the French Catholic Jesuits, right? So let's keep on going with examples of acculturation. We have Jamestown, and we're talking about religious syncretism. Another example is what historians call invisible institutions. Okay, so invisible institutions are institutions of enslaved people where they would meet in secret. They would sometimes meet illegally. They would, for these religious gatherings, right? These religious gatherings. So they could meet anywhere. It could be in the swamps. It could be in the secluded woods. You have different examples of these. One example of one of these invisible institutions is what's known as hush harbors. So during the antebellum period, before the Civil War, enslaved African Americans, they would hold religious gatherings in some type of secluded, secret location. And they did this because this was an environment where they could freely blend aspects of Christian belief as well as their African spiritual traditions. They can blend them together, right? So hush harbors were pretty popular. Another example I like to throw out there, what are known as praise houses, right? So there is an image on the screen there. It was taken in 1995, but it's survived, right? And we have a few of them. South Carolina, this one is located in South Carolina, and they even have some in Georgia as well. But praise houses, they're small structures, usually made of wood, and these are structures that were located on slave plantations. And this was a place where the enslaved population could go and they could worship, right? And they would go there and they would fuse African music and dance. They would fuse it with components of Christian worship. So again, we see that religious syncretism, the blending of the two. This is very common if you're familiar with the Gullah culture. That's a great example of that. These spaces, the hush harbors, the praise houses, it's in these spaces that spirituals are really birthed, right? So spirituals, sometimes they're called African American spirituals, sometimes they're called Negro spirituals, but in these spaces, spirituals are birthed, which if you look at a spiritual, it's a mixture of African rhythms, African singing, and beliefs from Christianity all blended together, right? So we have that. The last example of acculturation that I would like to provide is the Cherokee Phoenix. Cherokee Phoenix. So Cherokee Phoenix, this is the first Native American newspaper in the United States. Okay? So this came out in 1828, and it came as a result of pressure that was placed on the Cherokee nations in the mid-1820s. So the Cherokee Nation, primarily that was located in Georgia and surrounding states, there was pressure placed on them to give up their sovereignty as well as to relocate. So what they did in response to that is they created the Cherokee Phoenix to bring attention to the crisis that was before them. This was also created as a way to keep the nation together, to garner support. They would get so much support from the Cherokee Phoenix. You had people even outside of the country reading the Cherokee Phoenix, right? So the Cherokee Phoenix is an example of acculturation because this is, the way this is styled, this media is really styled in like an English style type of print and media. So you see that blending of the two, right? So although we're talking about the Cherokee Nation, there are components from another culture to produce the Cherokee Phoenix. And the Cherokee Phoenix, if you notice the date, 1828, this is just 2 years before the Indian Removal Act of 1830. So they were really ahead before this act was passed with kind of just making it known what they were dealing with as far as being forced to relocate. Now let's transition to assimilation. So we've spoken about acculturation, which there are aspects of, you know, we see of your original culture and the dominant culture, but let's talk about assimilation, that fully blended in. The best example of assimilation I think that I can provide are what are known as Indian boarding schools. Now, just by show of hands, how many of you, you're nodding your heads, how many of you have heard of Indian boarding schools, right? Okay, great, 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 great. So we're on the same page here, and we'll talk about this throughout the presentation. So Indian boarding schools are a great example, right? America really has a very long and extensive history of not only displacing people, displacing Native Americans, but also attempts to assimilate Native nations. We see that a lot. And historically, when you're talking about assimilation, anytime you're reading a historical document, assimilation is never really referred to as assimilation. It's usually referred to as civilizing, okay? So when you read a historical document and it says civilizing, 9 times out of 10, it's talking about assimilation, right? So assimilation. Now, as far as assimilation, America's history of this goes back all the way to colonial America. We see efforts to assimilate Native groups. You see it even in George Washington's presidency. The treaties that he had with Native nations, there are assimilation components in it. To Jefferson, it goes on and on and on and on and beyond. But where we will begin is, let's begin with 1819. Very important. So in the year 1819, the Civilization Fund Act of 1819 is passed. Civilization Fund Act of 1819, this is a law that provides funding for the education of Native children. Now, initially the funding was used to support missionary day-run schools, because you had missionaries that established day schools on reservations. They were already doing that. So initially this was established to assist that, but this law would open the door for boarding schools to be birthed, right? So according to the Civilization Fund Act of 1819, I didn't put the entire act there. We don't have time to read the entire act, so I just cut and paste I highlighted the best parts for you. According to the act, the whole purpose of the act is for introducing among them the habits and arts of civilization. That's the whole purpose of it. Now keep in mind everything I'm telling you, right? So that's the purpose of it. Now let me just explain the mission day schools. So the mission day schools, again, they existed prior to this law in 1819. These schools were usually located on a reservation, right? So the experience would be Native children could go to the school during the day, and then once school was over, they would go back to their communities and their families, right? They did that. But because children returned home, government officials believed that day schools weren't really the best approach for assimilation. So instead, the idea is, let's go ahead and create a way where we can isolate them from their family, isolate them from their community and their culture. This would be more effective in assimilating. And the response to that idea is what's known as Indian boarding schools. By the time we get to the 1870s, so this law passed in 1819, by the time we get to the 1870s, there is a transition. This is when the government, specifically the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but the government will take a more direct role in the education of Native children, right? So as opposed to the missions who were receiving funding for these schools, now we start to see more government-operated schools around this time. So you have American Indian, you have Alaska Natives, you have Native Hawaiian children who will be taken from their families, they'll be taken from their communities to attend these boarding schools throughout the nations and also the U.S. territories. Now with the children who attended these boarding schools, they could be as young as 4 years old. okay? As young as 4 years old. And they would be sent to a boarding school that could be thousands of miles away. Usually these boarding schools were set up in white communities, and these boarding schools, once the students arrived, they weren't allowed to return home. You know, even during breaks, they weren't allowed to return home. You have Native American children who attended these schools sometimes for 4 years or more, who never saw their families, and their families never saw them again. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, right? So I want you, again, put the humanity back into it. Your 4-year-old is sent away, thousands of miles away, in the care of someone else. One of the first government-funded federal Indian boarding schools is the Carlisle Indian Boarding School. Okay, very important school. I have some images here. It was established in 1879. That's when this school was established. And this school is important. There were many, but this school is important because it became a model for Indian boarding schools, right? Because of the success of this school will contribute to the expansion of more Indian boarding schools. And the gentleman who was the first superintendent of the school is a man known as Richard Henry Pratt. Okay? Sometimes he's referred to as R.H. Pratt. Richard Henry Pratt, he was an Army man, U.S. Army first lieutenant, and he served again as the school's first superintendent. He believed that education provided off reservations would make it easier to assimilate Native Americans, right? Specifically in assimilating them to the English culture, right? Speaking English, the actual language, but also assimilating them to develop trades, skills in that way. Now, with him, he has a very interesting philosophy about assimilation that we'll explore a little bit. So in 1892, Pratt, he delivered a speech at a national conference. This conference was located in Denver, Colorado. And in this speech, he shares his philosophy on assimilation, right? Now, the title of the speech, let's start there, just the name of the speech. The name of the speech is The Advantages of Mingling Indians with Whites. That's the name of the speech. And in the speech, he presents different arguments, basically explaining why Native Americans are savage, right? And that's the term that we see often historically, why they're savage. His speech is primarily, he uses different illustrations. That's most of the speech, right? It's pages long. It's a fascinating speech. I would encourage you to read it. But he presents examples of why they're savage, and he explains that they are this way because they lack association with, quote, English-speaking and civilized people, right? That's what he says. He is the person with that famous quote you may have heard of, right? Kill the Indian in him and save the man. So that was from this speech in 1892, right? So the sole purpose of these boarding schools was to assimilate Native American children to white American culture. And the way they did this with a couple of things. One, they forced them to convert to Christianity. That's the first one. They also cut their hair into European styles, right? They changed their names to English names. There is one account that I read of one former student from an Indian boarding school, and she mentions her experience coming in. And she says when she came in, there was a board, a list of names, and you just had to choose one. And she just pointed at whatever was before her. Didn't really understand, but just pointed, and that was the name that they gave her, right? Part of that assimilation not only included changing their names to English names, it included cutting them off as far as communication with their relatives and their community. They could be punished for speaking their native language. They had to speak English. And they were taught once they came, essentially that their culture was primitive, that it was inferior, and they needed, in order to advance, to assimilate in the ways that they were being offered. Now, with the Indian boarding schools, there are overwhelming, and I mean reports, about the children who attended these Indian boarding schools. Overwhelming reports about the physical, the mental, the emotional, the sexual abuse that they experience, really all at the hands of the staff that existed at these schools, right? So some of the punishment that these students would receive, and again, as young as 4, and they could be older. We have an example here of a young man, and this is him in 1882. The second picture is him 3 years later. So some of the punishment that they could receive. Children could be beaten, that's one. Sometimes they would be punished with electric shock. Solitary confinement was also a punishment that they received. They would also be punished by withholding food and water from them. That was another form of punishment. Sometimes they would go long periods of forced labor. They were overworked. Many of these Indian boarding schools, they were in terrible shape, and in order to keep them up, the children participated to that, contributed to that, excuse me. So they not only attended the school, but they had to help upkeep the school itself, right? You have that. You had some who they would have them kneeling for long periods of time. Sometimes they would even have older children, and I want you to think about the psychology of this. They would have force older children to punish the younger ones, right? And unfortunately, as I mentioned, the physical, the sexual, emotional abuse, this is very common. Very, very common. These schools were overcrowded. They were typically in poor condition. So many students, if not from the punishment, they would become ill or even die from the malnutrition, as well as diseases. Diseases like measles and tuberculosis, right? In 2021, the U.S. began researching Indian boarding schools, because Indian boarding schools, they existed throughout the United States. Canada also had quite a lot of them. If you do like a quick Google search, you will find a map of all of the Indian boarding schools which existed, right? But in the United States, in 2021, the government began investigating these schools in 2021. I haven't looked at the updates to this point, but I know at that time they found that these Indian boarding schools were responsible for more than 500 children, the deaths of 500 children, right? They found these children in both marks and as well as unmarked graves. There are some graves that have a headstone and they don't have a name on them, so we know there's a body, we just don't know who it is, right? So no way to contact the family. Some of these kids never made it back. So that happened. So this is part of the assimilation process, and this is also part of American history. And we don't have time, I mean, as I mentioned to you before, to get into everything, but this just skims the surface, okay? This just skims the surface, because when you're talking about essentially cultural genocide, you can go to the 1970s where you had unauthorized sterilization of Native women. So this is really just skimming the surface in terms of this history. So that's one example of assimilation, right? The other example, I don't have it on the board here, but I'll just still talk about it, or we'll move forward and I'll talk about it in the next slide. We'll do that. Let's move into how does assimilation and acculturation occur. So we've explained what they are. I've provided you with some examples, but how does it actually happen, right? How does it happen? Typically one of 3 ways. And sometimes these can kind of overlap, but for the most part, one of 3 ways. One, acculturation, assimilation can be forced, it can be voluntary, and then it can be under coercion, right? And we'll explain that. So in terms of force, right, the Indian boarding schools are a great example. So with the Indian boarding schools, let's say education on a certain reservation wasn't available. It wasn't an option. You do have some parents that chose to send their kids to this school. Yeah, that happened. But most of the Native children that attended this were forced to attend, right? You had government agents that were on reservations. What they would do is they would gather the children and then they would transport them to these schools. Then once we get to 1891, in 1891, Congress passes a law that requires Native children to attend schools. So by 1891, they have to attend. So after this law is passed, you have many agents who are pressuring parents, maybe parents who are hesitant, who don't want to send their children to this school. Well, they would pressure them sometimes by withholding supplies like food. so that they would send their children to these schools. If they didn't, in some cases, you would even have the police come in and they would seize the children and bring them to these schools. So the Indian boarding schools, great example of assimilation being, and even acculturation, but more specifically, assimilation being forced, right? Great example, being forced. Another great example is the slave trade, right? So let's shift over to that. The whole idea of acquiring human cargo for the slave trade, that entire process is forced. So let's just look at the beginning of that process. What does that look like? From start to finish, taking a human being and enslaving them. What does that look like? So in the 15th century, you had European nations that began establishing relationships with local African leaders, primarily on the west coast, right? West coast of Africa, excuse me. And they began, Florida too, yeah. Don't go after my home state. We're recording this. Don't go after my home state, all right? We're going to keep Florida out of this presentation. If we're going to attack anyone, attack everyone else, okay? Not Florida. So in the 15th century, we have European nations building relationships with African leaders on the west coast of Africa, right? Western coast. Eventually, they are provided permission to build forts, and these forts would be their trading ports, where the slave traders would, of course, acquire the slaves and then place them on the ships. So Europeans, as far as acquiring actual enslaved people, Europeans participated in some slave raiding on Africa, some of it, but it wasn't primarily the method used to acquire human cargo. Primarily, the way it went was you would have African rulers and traders who would capture, they would supply to the European traders Africans who they would then enslave. Then the European traders would take them and, of course, bring them through different parts of the Americas, right? Typically, Europeans weren't allowed into like Western and Central Africa in the interior. So as far as the Africans on that continent, they really controlled that aspect of the trade. Now, keep in mind that Africa at this time, Africa has multiple countries, very diverse, not just countries, but you have different states, nations, all of the ethnic groups, all of that, right? Different political structures, social structures. You had large empires all the way to very small states. So acquiring human beings in order to place them into the slave trade, sometimes it would be a result of these different communities who were at conflict with one another. So think prisoner of war, right? So prisoner of war, sometimes after a military or a political conflict, you know, you'd have, again, a prisoner of war. You had people that were sometimes captured specifically for the slave trade. You had surprise raids on villages. Sometimes someone could be enslaved as a punishment for crime. Sometimes people were kidnapped, right? They were kidnapped. Let's kind of examine that a little bit as far as kidnapping, right? So if someone was kidnapped, what would happen is then the merchant would kidnap these people and they would force them to walk in a slave caravan. Now, the slave caravan would go to the coast where these European forts are. Sometimes they could walk for months. Sometimes you're talking about as long as 1,000 miles, right? And during this walk towards these forts on the coast, if someone was sick or they weren't able to make the full journey, they would either leave them there to die or they would just kill them, right? But they wanted the cargo, the human cargo, to go all the way. They would be shackled all the way there. And then once they got there, they would be in a holding place, sometimes even underground dungeons, be there maybe even as long as a year before a European trader takes them, places them on the ship, and then they go through that horrendous journey known as the Middle Passages, right? You even get to a point as this industry of slave trading continues where certain villages and towns in Africa, they start to build fortifications and a warning system because people were being kidnapped, right? Now, let me just give a caveat, right? We're gonna go on a side street, but we're gonna come back right back. Why are we going on a side street? Because I find that usually when I talk about slavery in Africa, there is a confusion, especially in America. For most of us, our first exposure to the slave trade is American slavery, which is race-based chattel slavery. You've had different forms of slavery throughout the world. throughout time, they're not always the same. You had slavery that existed in Africa before the slave trade, yes, but they're not the same. Africa, as far as slavery there, think of it more if you're familiar with like serfdom, kind of like that. People enslaved many times would acquire their freedom. They had certain rights. They could marry free persons, right? They may become a slave as a punishment of a crime, or they owed a debt, but it was definitely very different than race-based chattel slavery. So, slavery was something, that system that already existed on the continent, yes, and you also have slave trades that existed, like the Indian Ocean slave trade, which many people may not know about. It actually started before the transatlantic slave trade. It's a little understudied, but historians are studying it. You can find some information about it, right? So the idea of slavery has existed in many societies. The thing about the slave trade is this, and I find this interesting, is the idea of slavery existed, yes. So you have Africans on the continent who are trading with European traders, not really aware of what it would become. Eventually, once more knowledge comes about it, you do have some African nations that stop their participation in it. You do have things like that. But this is always the question that I kind of pose out there for people when they're like, well, why did they participate in it? How could they enslave their own people? How could they do that? Okay, let's stop. Let's think about a few things. Let's put the humanity back into it, right? And that's not for me to justify, it's just to provide context. One, a lot of times it's not that they were selling their own people. Just because they look the same doesn't mean they are the same. They could be different ethnic groups. They consider each other different. So that's the first thing. They're not always providing human cargo that is from their direct nation. That's one. The second thing is, because the form of slavery on Africa was very different than the transatlantic slave trade, if these people who left the continent, they get on the boats, they're placed on the boats forcibly, and then they're sent throughout the world. Remember, slavery is forever, right? When will those people ever come back to the continent? Who comes back to the continent and tells them what's happening? No one.
Yeah.
So to some extent, over time, there's a little bit of ignorance on the reality of it. We really don't see, in terms of those on the continent, understanding the magnitude of it until you get slave narratives like Equiano coming out, or you get missionaries who come with maybe a formerly enslaved person who's been converted, and now they're back on the continent trying to convert more people, and now this person can share, hey, this is what it looks like, right? This is what's happening. So also keep that in mind. These are people that leave the continent forever for an experience that's very different from where they've come from, and it's going to take some time before the people on the continent even are aware of what's really happening. And once they're aware, again, you do have some nations that start participating in it. But by the time that they become aware, there's so much transformation that has happened in the world and even the continent. We don't talk about it in this presentation, but you have to think, you have millions. It's estimated, like the last time I checked the number, 12.5 Africans have left the continent. Think about what that does for the population of that place. And a lot of them men. Think about what that does for the protection of different states. Think about the fact that they traded for European goods, and as a result of this, we really start to see the growth of militarized states in Africa, right? So now they have these European guns and gunpowder and all these things. It starts to transform the continent. I know in the United States, we really focus on the experience once they leave the continent, but think about what it does to the actual continent, right? So it forever changes, like significant parts of the world. So the whole acquisition of, the whole way that you acquire a human being and then turn them into a slave, that whole process is forced. No one asked to be a part of it, as opposed to maybe European, like the English settlements, where early on you had indentured servants. Indentured servants signed a contract. Indentured servants walked into it knowing that they were going to serve for a number of years, usually 5 to 7 years. Indentured servants sometimes, not always, they would get freedom dues once they served their contract, right? So they would get a little bit of something. Usually not enough to even purchase property, but the benefit of indentured servants in America is that once they serve their time, once it wasn't forever, you know, it wasn't until their death, once they serve their time, they become a free person in society, and they can blend into society in a way where no one ever recognizes that they were once ever indentured. The descendants of enslaved Africans don't have that luxury. Unfortunately, even if they become free, the distinct aesthetic is forever a mark in that country that you were either once enslaved, you are enslaved, or you're a descendant of one. Right? So very different experiences. So those are some examples of acculturation, assimilation, how they happen forcibly. What about voluntary? Let's talk about voluntary. Oh my goodness, look at the time. Is everyone enjoying themselves?
Yes.
Oh, I need to, you didn't tell me I talked this much.
It's not
I didn't even realize.
You're not over time yet.
I'm looking at time, I'm like, whoa, okay. Well, let's keep on going. Until they cut me off, let's keep on going. All right. So with assimilation, okay, could be, we went over it being forceful, right? It can be voluntary. So the Cherokee Phoenix, that was voluntary because they chose to put out a newspaper, right? That is a form of acculturation. It wasn't forced, it was voluntary. It was as a result of an impending crisis to make the nation aware. Then another form of voluntary assimilation and acculturation is what's known as religious conversion, right? Let's talk about that. So, sometimes religious conversion was chosen because it was a pathway to freedom. For example, in 1693, Spain's King Charles II, he issued a royal decree granting freedom and protection to all enslaved Africans who escaped the British colonies and who would come to Spanish territory, right? As long as they converted to Catholicism, as long as they promised to protect and to serve Spain, right? He promised that. So then what you have is you have all these fugitive enslaved people. They're going to leave places like South Carolina. They start heading towards Spanish Florida, right? We just had a conversation, Fred, right? Before this presentation about this, there's a great location, Fort Mose in Florida, where you can visit, and they talk about that. That's one of the locations where these enslaved would flee towards, and that's in St. Augustine. There was also an English principle that Christians shouldn't enslave other Christians. So you see this in early colonial practices. Specifically, if we look at Virginia, as it was a colony, you had some enslaved people who ended up suing for their freedom based on the fact that they were Christian. And oftentimes they won, right? Oftentimes they won. But you had slaveholders who were not favorable towards Christian conversion. So when we talk about Christianity or conversion, whether it's Catholicism or Protestantism, conversion as a justification for colonizing a people, not everyone was necessarily gung-ho about it, right? You had some slaveholders, they were fearful that if you converted enslaved people, they would then demand emancipation, right? You had some that were concerned if you Christianize them, then they will think of themselves as equal to whites. So not everyone was happy about it. There's one Anglican minister, James Blair. He talks about his skepticism. He talks about not really believing that these conversions were genuine. And by the time we get to the 17th century is when we start to see the codification of slavery as an institution. So we have slave codes where different colonies are implementing laws now, and they're really developing what slavery will look like as an institution. Virginia in 1667, they passed a law. It is called an act declaring that baptism of slaves doth not exempt them from bondage. So that was passed to say, even if you convert, you're not free, right? So we see that. So we do see religious conversion, something voluntary to acquire freedom. The last one is coercion, right? Coercion. So sometimes someone may voluntarily decide to assimilate or even acculturate, and think of this as a mixture between the two as a result of pressure, right? So maybe after a war, you have a choice, we'll either kill you or you sign this treaty. Yeah.
I had a quick question, well, a quick statement. I had read something the other day where in Virginia, even if you were a free indigenous person or a free African American, or what have you, that you could not purchase or own
Yeah,
a
that is it.
Christian white person.
Yep,
So you would have never had the opportunity to assimilate a person to your culture because legally you could not purchase anyone that did not look like you.
yeah, that's a great point.
That's just how wild it is as relates to how structured it was to protect whiteness and Christianity in that regard.
Yeah, that's a great example. Virginia is a great state. I like to be in their business. We won't talk about Florida. We're going to talk about everyone else. But we're not talking about Florida. I look at the camera because I'm from Florida. We're talking about everyone else, but not Florida, okay? But yeah, Virginia is a great state to look at their law, especially their slave codes. Really, really great. For the sake of time, what I will do is I'm going to open the floor to some questions. I will go through the rest of the presentation. Maybe we can kind of just, if there's something you'd like me to elaborate on, because I do want to respect your time. I didn't realize I was talking so much. So I also will talk about why does acculturation and assimilation occur. Some of the reasons it occurs is acculturation assimilation can be the result of religious conversion, colonization, conquest. Sometimes people assimilate as a way to have access to resources, survival, right? Sometimes it's a natural adaptation. So think of it this way. If you think about Native Americans, right? A certain generation is never going to know what it looks like or feels like to live in a space where the U.S. doesn't exist. They're naturally going to adapt. Same thing with enslaved Africans. So enslaved Africans, 1808, if you don't know, 1808, there was a law passed where the United States would no longer participate in the importation of enslaved people. People still did it anyways, all the way to the beginning of the Civil War, okay? So they still did it, and they would sometimes burn the ships, dump them in the water to hide the evidence. But if we think about that law on paper, where you no longer have people from the continent coming to the United States, that means each generation is a little bit further from their actual African roots because there's really no direct connection to the continent, and there's no one coming to tell them. So their world will really revolve around the U.S. Yes?
I just want to add something to that law that you mentioned. When he signed that law, Jefferson, that made domestic slaves more valuable too.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, good stuff. See, I love it. I love it. So,
But it did
Yeah.
hasten the end of slavery because it was in the Atlantically, but of course domestically you had his own slaves being more valuable. Whatever.
yeah, and Dylan, right? Okay, thank you, Dylan. So the last thing I'll mention, and feel free to cut me off. All these people, when they watch this online, they're going to be like, this lady didn't get through half of it. I'm sorry. To those of you in the online world, I apologize. But feel free, you can sign up for a course at the local college and you can learn more. The last thing I'll mention is assimilation and acculturation happens as a result of American expansionism. So American expansionism, you're talking about the late 18th century, early 20th century, some examples of that: Louisiana Purchase, Indian removal. 1840s is probably the best example. When you talk about Mexican-American War, you talk about the Texas Revolt, this is when we acquired California and New Mexico and all these places, right? So American expansionism, we always see that related. It merges with acculturation and assimilation. So I'll just throw a question out there. Whenever the U.S. has acquired new territory, whether it's here, overseas, when have they ever acquired territory that was vacant? I can tell you the answer.
None.
None.
Yeah.
So now the question is, what do you do with the people who live there? The people who live there will eventually become that minority culture that will have to be absorbed into that dominant culture, right? That American culture. So again, I have 2 minutes. Any thoughts, questions? Should I keep on going with my 2 minutes? Yes, Dylan, and I'll come to you, Mark.
I wanted
Yes.
to ask you a question about religion.
Yeah.
Again, about Jefferson, he wrote what's called Jefferson Bible.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, he cut out all the miracles and
Yeah.
all that. And that was a way to show the Native Americans Christianity without having the miracles and what he considered fiction.
Yeah.
How did we go from that to Dawes Act?
Oh, Dawes Act?
Yeah, I think you mentioned that before. Signed by Cleveland.
Yes, I didn't even get to the Dawes Act, but you're in my notes. Thank you. You're in my notes. So Jefferson Bible, that's interesting you mentioned that. I don't even think they published it at that
No,
time.
he did not.
Yeah.
He wrote to us.
Yeah, and he wrote a Bible basically extracting the miracles of Jesus. So it was more or less a book about principle, kind of that. But I think that Bible is a good example of the Enlightenment period, right? Because you have to think, he was a deist, right? So that is a reflection of that time and what people believe. That's a great example. And then your second part was, tell me again, the Dawes Act?
The Dawes Act was basically them just forcing
Okay.
standard religion onto Native people. So how do we go from Jeffersonian, Madisonian assimilation to boarding schools?
Boarding schools?
And
Okay, so I hope I understand you correctly so I can answer it. Okay, so with assimilation, it's interesting. Assimilation, you know, part of American history, let's be honest, one of the things I love about America is we're a little bit of a reality show, you know? We fluctuate in the things that we do. We can be honest with ourselves. I'm American, you're American, we fluctuate. One day we want to do things, one day we don't. You know, maybe we agree to something, then the next day we take it back, you know? And I'm joking, in case you didn't, I'm not being literal, right?
Jerry Springer episode.
Very Jerry Springer. So I say that because what ends up happening is you see in American history, there's this effort, even like Jefferson, to assimilate Native Americans and talking about, well, they're civilized, I think they could become American, right? But then we get to the 1840s, the Indian Removal Act, and it's kind of like a flipperoo. You have what are called the 5 civilized tribes, right? Tribes that essentially, and that wasn't necessarily a compliment, that the U.S. considered more advanced than other tribes because they had assimilated to European culture. So like you had the Cherokee that had a constitution that was modeled after the U.S. Constitution. They had a written language, things like that. So you have evidence of efforts to assimilate Native groups. You have Native groups that do assimilate, right? But they never are really fully integrated into the U.S. as Americans. Because then in 1830, you have the Indian Removal Act, and that includes those groups that quote-unquote were civilized, right? The ones that kind of met them halfway. You even had some Native nations that they did not want to move, so they tried to come to a compromise and said, hey, let's give them some territory, and hopefully we can keep the rest. And you know what the U.S. did? The U.S. said no, and eventually sent the military to force them to move. So there is this shifting from, you're very savage, you need to be civilized, we're going to assimilate you, don't really think you'll ever fully assimilate, let's remove you, and then it fluctuates again. Okay, let's assimilate you. You'll see that over and over again. Yeah. I'll come back to you, let me take his question,
Okay.
Mark.
Well, it's not so much a question as an observation.
Yeah.
You know, you're talking about assimilation and acculturation. I can't spit that word out.
Acculturation.
Thank you. It seems like in assimilation, you know, the force and the coercion is built in. There is some, in the acculturation, there is some, as you've noted, some voluntary changes that go on.
Yeah.
So I think of, you know, Gullah Geechee
Yeah.
culture and the religious aspects of that. Oh, we're going to pluck some of your Christianity. We're also going to pluck some of our West African culture and philosophy, if you will. Same thing with Santeria down in the islands.
Yep. Yep.
And then you get places like Winston-Salem, and the thing about you can't own a Christian, well, that's a huge conflict for that community.
Yeah. 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 It's
I
a great
could go on,
observation.
but I'm not going to go on.
Yeah, no, that's a great observation. Now it's 12:03, let me just say this. I know this is just an hour, so I will totally respect. Should I go ahead and wrap up and then we can have an after party, but the people online may be jealous?
Absolutely, yeah, go
Okay.
ahead and wrap up.
Okay, let's wrap up. So the people online might be a little bit jealous. They're not going to get the after party notes. If you stay for the after party, I'm going to talk about paternalism, right? And how that kind of covers acculturation and assimilation. But from what we've seen, right, we see the relationship between information to really examine on how we can move forward. What do we learn from these things, especially when we watch a history, a cycle of things happening over and over again. How do we prevent the things we don't want to happen again, and how can we expound on those areas where we think we're okay, right, or good. So I will stop the presentation here. I want to thank everyone for coming out today. Thank you to those who will watch online as well. Thank you to the entire team, staff, volunteers. You've been extra kind. Hopefully, because I talked over my time, I'll be invited back again. We don't know, but we'll see. We'll see. I'm away. Either way, we'll see. But think about this as we turn 250 years old next year. Think about the United States and its entire history without omitting anything. That is who we are, right? That is who we are. Yeah.